The first roundtable of the ADEMU kickoff conference focused on the question, what type of fiscal union? Addressing the sovereign debt crisis and the result from an incomplete design of the EMU. Even if the financial part is getting better, we need to be aware that the financial crisis is still severe for some economies, and we have to take very seriously the beginning of what could be a political crisis, and the mistrust from European institutions is stronger than ever.
Okay, so, thank you very much. First of all, I should say, when I was at the Bank of England for the last 14 years, there were two things I didn't talk about. The first of those was fiscal policy. That's the responsibility of the Treasury, and unlike the ECB, which has a lot of people working on fiscal policy, we have half a person. The other thing we were never supposed to talk about was other countries' policies. So Ramon has totally screwed my record by requiring me both to talk about fiscal policy and about other countries. Anyway, I thought I'd just say a few words on three issues. Firstly, the question of preventing an unstable public debt spiral. Secondly, the issue of risk sharing across the Union. And thirdly, a little bit about getting the aggregate fiscal policy stance right from a stabilisation perspective. So on the first of these, the issue of stopping an unstable public debt spiral, I think first of all we need to recognise that there is a narrative of the crisis that lays the blame at the door of lax fiscal policy, and this is a view that you particularly get in Germanic circles, not all German economists of course, but it is something that figures in the international discussions that I've been present at. And it helps to account for the attempts to strengthen the Stability and Growth Pact, giving it more teeth by permitting fines for excessive deficits under qualified majority voting, an enhanced role for the Commission and peer review, and so forth, all the things that are in the Sixth Pact. Now, the Stability and Growth Pact Mark I clearly wasn't a very effective tool. I think there were 34 breaches alone in the period up until 2007, so it clearly wasn't biting all that much. And that alone might suggest, well, we certainly need some reform to make it work more effectively. But there is a question about whether the German narrative is right. It fits Greece and maybe Portugal, but as was pointed out in the first session this afternoon, it's not really clear that it fits elsewhere. The Eurozone crisis didn't particularly afflict Belgium and Italy, which were countries that had difficult fiscal positions going into the crisis, but of course did hit Ireland and Spain, which had good fiscal positions going into the crisis. And what was going on here was really a private credit boom that had gone wrong and resulted in a catastrophic deterioration in the fiscal position as tax revenues slumped and resources had to be pumped into banking systems to keep them afloat. Now, the Stability and Growth Pact Mark II that we have with the Sixth Pack and all of that, I think does have the potential to be more divisive. I think levying fines on countries is bound to create tensions. But there is also a question about really whether it's addressing the potential vulnerabilities that might be out there, given how quickly fiscal positions can deteriorate when there's something like a financial crisis. And I do wonder whether the arrangements need to emphasise a bit more creating fiscal space when times are good, as opposed to penalising people when you start hitting high debt and deficit levels. And that, again, as I say, was brought out in, I guess, Hazel's presentation this afternoon, that the fiscal position looked really good for Spain in the years leading up to the crisis before deteriorating and resharpening. It's even more true for Ireland. Now, one suggestion here, which I think might be worth considering, taking a leaf out of what central banks are doing as regards to the financial system, is thinking whether there's some role for something like stress testing in the macroeconomic sphere and in the fiscal sphere. So trying to investigate how quickly fiscal positions could deteriorate if there are bad shocks. And that would be different in different countries, depending on things like the size of the financial sector and so forth. On the second issue of risk sharing, clearly one model of operating the fiscal union is that of the US, with debt neutralization, common fiscal policy, interregional fiscal transfers. But as was pointed out during the discussion in the last session, these are interregional transfers that happen pretty automatically through the tax system. It doesn't require the governor of one state having to go and beg in Washington, or even worse, in some other state for support. Now, whatever its merits as an option, as an outcome, I don't think this is really something that is on the table at present. And it's only feasible, I think, to expect countries like Germany to sign up to some arrangement like that if they can reasonably expect to move from a position of being a creditor country to being on the other side of the fence, the debtor role, in a reasonably short time period. It's almost as though you want to be able to put countries in a Rawlsian state of ignorance about whether they're Greece or Germany. Then they might all sign up to it. But if you know you're Germany, you're not going to sign up to something which might tie you in to having to make large transfers to Greece or some other country. So I think we're stuck, at least for the foreseeable future, with something which has much more limited risk sharing. And moreover, concerns about moral hazard means that what risk sharing there is only going to come with considerable strings attached. So that means significant intervention in national policies. Now, there are some good aspects of that, because in principle it means that the risk premia on sovereign debt can play a disciplinary role on individual countries' debt accumulation. But of course it also opens up the possibility of self-fulfilling runs on the sovereign. So expectations of default lead to rising risk premia, worsened debt dynamics, and may in the worst case actually lead to a cut-off in lending altogether. Now, in the world of banking, where I've come from, of course, the way that's broken is through a lender of last resort role for the central bank. They deal with the issue of moral hazard by saying that when you act as lender of last resort, you lend against collateral, good collateral that you can value, but only at a penalty rate, the Badger principles. Now, I do think we've moved into a significantly better place post-crisis with the creation of the European Stability Mechanism. That gives us a European lender at last resort. There's a question about the scale of the resources that it has at its disposal, and there may be issues about tweaking the way it operates, and the paper of Ramon this morning, or sorry, first this afternoon, the first session, was in that space of thinking about how we might be able to make it more effective. But I think it does raise the question, since the ESM is, I think as Ramon put it, it's the emergency ward. The question about can you provide insurance which might apply in in a wider range of circumstances. And here I do wonder whether there's more scope for member states to issue contingent sovereign debt, and in particular things like GDP-linked bonds, which Bob Schiller has talked about a lot. So this might be something to think about a bit more as part of the research programme. Finally, on the topic of achieving the right aggregate fiscal stance, I think it helps to start by observing, and again this was brought out in a slide that was shown earlier on this afternoon, that the recovery has been markedly slower in the Eurozone than in, say, the United Kingdom or the United States, and that shows up pretty clearly in unemployment. Unemployment in the Eurozone is around about 10%, in the UK and the US it's back down to 5%. Moreover, it's the case that underlying inflation, core inflation in the Eurozone, has been consistently running at around about 1% for the past few years, not close to 2%, the ECB's target. Now, to me, that's a clear sign that macroeconomic policy has been too tight, that a looser macroeconomic policy stance is warranted. Now, part of the problem here has obviously been an overly tight aggregate fiscal stance. And in particular, what's happened is that necessary fiscal consolidation in periphery countries in response to the ballooning of debt and deficits hasn't really been matched by appropriate loosening of fiscal policies in the core, and particularly in Germany. And here the problems, the asymmetry of the burden of adjustment, that there's always a stronger weight on debtor countries to adjust than there is for creditors to take the other side. And this is an old problem. Keynes struggled with it in trying to think how to design the international monetary institutions under Bretton Woods. Didn't really solve it. Although the first best would be to try and solve that problem of an asymmetry in the burden of adjustment, put more weight on the creditor countries to play their part, I think one has to recognise that that asymmetry in the burden of adjustment is probably going to be still with us. So that pushes you to second best solutions, and that's where you start looking for a central instrument that can be applied to get the aggregate fiscal stance in the Union right. And here I think there's an interesting idea in the Five Presidents report for an investment, a public investment instrument which could be varied appropriately to keep the aggregate fiscal stance right. I think, though, there is a question about how effectively it will operate in practice, because public investment is not something you can easily turn on and off. You can change things like VAT rates overnight, but public investment projects take time to plan, implement, and so forth. There's significant gestation lags. So unless you have some pipeline of shovel-ready projects that are always there that you can just turn the tap on, there will be an issue about whether the change in the fiscal stance will be timely enough. To conclude this little bit, I should say, of course, even if fiscal policy overall is too tight, in principle, you can offset that with monetary policy. But the fact that inflation has been, underlying inflation has been below the 2%, or just below target of the ECB, with core inflation running about 1%, to me is a symptom of the fact that whereas the ECB was acting very promptly in dealing with immediate liquidity pressures associated with the crisis, was rather slower to move into some of the more unorthodox monetary policy measures, and I'm thinking obviously here of asset purchase, quantitative easing, which we and the Fed started in 2009, but of course the ECB has only recently embraced. And indeed the ECB's balance sheet was actually shrinking in recent years as the LTROs were running off. Now, we know why the ECB took a long time to get where it was, and that was because of suspicion of asset purchases in some parts of the Union, particularly Germany. But I think that has been an issue which has led to unnecessarily slow growth. I wanted to conclude with one other observation about the research programme of this project, the ADEMU project. Having observed the process of reinventing the institutional superstructure of the Union, sort of on the margins, I've obviously being a representative of the Bank of England, I've not being in the Eurozone, not being central in the discussions about reforming the institutional architecture of the Eurozone, but I've observed it on the fringes in various international meetings that I've attended in recent years, in the former ECOFIN, G20 and stuff like that. And one thing that has struck me is that there's lots of analyses by academic economists of the various issues that come up. Some are very good, very smart, so forth. And academic economists are very good at working out what's the optimal solution to a particular problem. What they're not so good at is working out what will actually fly in political circles. And one of the things I really liked about Jesus' presentation this afternoon is his desire to take the political economy of what was going on seriously. And I think it will be quite important for the various work strands that this research programme is going to be pushing forward, for the people involved in those to think about not just what's the right way to do this, but also is it consistent with the political incentives and imperatives that the decision makers actually face. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here. My first intervention will be basically on something that has to do with rather than optimal fiscal policy or monetary policy or optimal design of those policies, has more to do with institutional design. And in particular, because I'm now a member of the Advisory Board of the Independent Fiscal Institution in Spain, I would like to talk about one institution that plays a crucial role in order to oversee the sustainability of public finance in the different countries in the European Union. Those institutions are known under the name of Independent Fiscal Institutions, IFIs, and they have played an important role in overseeing which kind of policies are allowed to have sustainable debt and sustainable public finances in general. So I think that those institutions have been quite successful in general, although the experience in different countries varies a lot. And now, in the 5 Presidents report, there is a special mention to the creation of an advisory European fiscal board that is not very well defined, so we need a lot of posterior thinking about how to design this board, but that the idea is that this board will coordinate the existing IFIs, although preserving the independency of those national IFIs. And this is a problem of how I think that this is something that perhaps we should contribute from the point of view of agency theory or other approaches of how to design this connection between this European IFI and the national IFIs. So this is an issue that in the 5 President report just released in June is something that is on the table and think about. So let me just summarize what are those IFIs about, briefly for the ones of you that do not even know about the existence of these institutions. Just let me tell you that these institutions are quite often, quite common around the world. Okay, because it has been it's a consensus that they generate beneficial effects for public finance, sustainability, growth, and general well-being. The first IFI was created in 1947 in Netherlands, and after that many countries followed the example of Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, and some others. One of the most famous IFI, not in Europe, is the Congressional Budget Office, created in 1975 under the Nixon administration when fiscal discipline at that time was not so well followed by the Nixon administration. Let me say that the current IFIs, we can distinguish 2 types of IFIs. One is the IFIs that follow the Anglo-Saxon system, like in the US, Canada, and Netherlands, the first one, in which the IFIs set benchmarks for the fiscal debate. And those IFIs perform positive analysis, so they make macro forecasts. So if the government says, okay, the growth of the GDP growth next year will be 4%, they make an independent assessment of whether this prediction is correct or not according to their own methodology. Also perform cost-benefit analysis of different policies, and also in some cases perform evaluation of electoral programs. So this kind of Anglo-Saxon IFIs rely more on market discipline than on rules. However, the European, let's call it the European system of IFIs, that were all the IFIs that were created after the public debt crisis, are more inspired in the German system. So in this type of IFIs, they rely on numerical rules. So there are targets of public budget deficit, there are targets of debt to GDP ratio, and then the only thing that they have to do is check whether the government is following policies aimed at fulfilling these ratio requirements. The advantage of this European approach to IFIs is that to follow just ratios or rules is simple, is more politically acceptable, especially in a heterogeneous context. So we have several countries, and then there is a general rule at the European level saying that these are the ratios, 60% ratio of public debt to GDP. Then well, we apply this rule to all the countries, and then the IFIs of the corresponding countries, the only thing that they have to check is whether the rule is satisfied. Then this makes everything more acceptable, because then we prevent countries from being free riders and these other aspects. Moreover, the IFIs have the advantage of provide proximity, because they operate at the national level, and then also, since they are independent, are quite successful in communicating the to the society and also to the political parties the benefits associated with sustainability. Let me repeat that after the 2008 crisis, then many IFIs were created in Hungary, in Slovenia, Romania, Spain, France, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, Slovakia. and all these IFEs were following this scenario, this benchmark that was the European benchmark. So that is just check the fulfillment of fiscal rules. From the point of view of the models, I have mentioned these two, the Anglo-Saxon and the European, but then also in each country the IFEs have different adscriptions to different instances. For instance, we have in Greece that the budget office is like in the US, a parliamentary budget office, so it's a commission of the parliament. In other places have an independent status, like if they were central banks, Estonia, other places, even in Spain, even though the dependency from the central government is quite strong. So this means that there are several institutional arrangements at the national level about how independent and from who are independent those IFEs. Let me say that in Spain, which is the example that I know more, the IFE called IREF, Independent Authority for Fiscal Responsibility, was created in 2013 and was a consequence of the lack of credibility of the Spanish finances and the rescue of the banking sector. In fact, this forced the modification of the Spanish Constitution in 2011, where the principle of budget stability was set forth in its Article 135. And then one of the implications of the rescue was that Spain had to create an IFE to oversee the sustainability of the Spanish public finances. This IFE in Spain, as I said, follows the European system, so makes macro projections, independent macro projections. So when we oversee whether our ratios fulfill or not, we look at the numerator and the denominator. We make ex-ante assessments of the risk of deviation, we make ex-post assessments of the outcomes, we make analysis of sustainability, analysis of budget transparency, but as I told you, we do not make cost-benefit analysis of fiscal measures, nor we analyze the impact of economic policy on long-run growth and employment. The main instrument that we have is those reports on macro forecast, on budget targets, on correction measures, also on the fulfillment of the pension sustainability factor. We make opinions, analysis, etc. Then the only instrument, and this is a really big enforcement instrument that we have, is just that the administration to which we send a report, this administration, either the central government or regional government or a municipality or the social security system, has to adopt the recommendation in the report or has to explain why it does not adopt this recommendation. So the principle is this: adopt or explain. You can say, okay, they always can explain, so they can do nothing. Well, but it turns out that this has consequences, because, for instance, we publish in our webpage what are the recommendations that the IFE makes to each administration, and then you put in another column what has been the answer, if this answer has been received or not, the certification. So the idea is to build credibility as an institution by making all the decisions transparent to the society. Okay, and I think that at the beginning this was a disaster because nobody was paying attention to our recommendations, but now, due to the cost of lack of credibility, I think that things are improving a lot. This institution in Spain is especially important because due to the Memorandum of Understanding and other laws that come after this, like the law of fiscal stability and sustainability of public administrations, sets rules for Spain that are much stringent than for the European Union. For instance, the Constitution were forced to have a 0% structural deficit, compared with the 0.5 at the European Union in structural deficit and 3% in terms of nominal deficit. The target for the public debt GDP ratio is the same than in Europe, 60%. However, since we are far from this 60%, we are at 100%, the path of convergence towards this target in Spain is quite strong. It has to be reached, the 60% target, in 2020. I can announce that for sure in 2010-20 we will not reach this 60%, because this means a path of reduction of the public debt at the speed of almost 20% per year, and this is something that no country can achieve. Then we have other strong rules concerning the convergence of deficit. Also, we have something that is not at the European Union level, that is what is called the public spending rule, which means that the public spending in Spain cannot grow at a rate higher than the GDP growth. Okay? This is because we know that all the fiscal consolidation efforts can be achieved by increasing revenues or by reducing expenditure, but we know there are several papers, Alessina also have showed us that the effective way of making a fiscal consolidation is through reductions in public spending. So to have this upper bound in the rate of public spending turns out to be one of the most effective way of consolidating public finances. And finally, we have also a sustainability factor for public pensions, and also we check that the evolution of pensions is compatible with the sustainability factor. Then, just let me conclude my small talk by talking about what I said at the beginning, the 5 presidents' report on the IFIS. So if you have read this report released in June 2015, the document says that every member state must stick to the rules, and then in order to reinforce the credibility of those rules, then the European Union should create an advisory European fiscal board. And then explicitly this document says that this new advisory entity would coordinate and complement the national fiscal councils, the IFIS, that have been set up in the context of the European Union Directive on Budgetary Frameworks. So the idea is that this new institution, the Advisory European Fiscal Board, will coordinate those entities, but the question is whether the independency of those IFIs will be preserved or not under this new scenario. And this is something that, for instance, in Spain, at our IFI, we are really concerned whether this will put in danger the independence. Coordination is fine, but one of the best assets of these IFIs is the proximity. They know the specificities of the budgetary process in each country, and I think that this is something that should be preserved, and I think that putting general rules, if they turn out to be very specific, then perhaps this will go against the principle of proximity. Another interesting thing that is in the Annex 3 of the 5 presidents' report is that, this is funny because it says that this Advisory European Fiscal Board should advise, not implement policy. To enforce the rules should remain the task of the European Commission. which should be able to deviate from the views of the board, provided that it has justifiable reasons and explain them. So notice that this is a way, at least as I read it, is a way of saying that the principle that we apply in Spain, that is adopt or to explain, in fact is translated at the European level. So this, I think that, well, you can say that this is something very mild, but it turns out that in the basic design of this board, this principle of adopt or explain is also at least considered. And just let me say that even though that the creation of this board creates concerns in the national IFIs, I have to say that those IFIs have created a voluntary network to share experiences, to make some coordination. It's a voluntary network, but I think that the IFIs also want to get this coordination, and this network was created last month. The secretariat of the network is in Bratislava, in Slovakia, and the president of the network is the president of the Spanish IFIs. So I think that is a first step towards this coordination. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me pick up on the thought that economists can think of the optimal policies, but they need to then wonder whether they will fly. And that involves not just thinking about whether they're politically feasible, but also whether they will work from a legal aspect. So as a lawyer, I thought I could contribute to this discussion by just giving you a sense of some of the challenges and issues that lawyers are looking at in this context. And I particularly wanted to start by taking the idea in the Five Presidents report that at least in the early stage, the process of delivering on those objectives will be one of deepening by doing, building on existing instruments and making the best possible use of existing treaties. So with that thought in mind, what can we learn from looking at, in particular, banking union, which is the most developed area so far in this process of deepening by doing? Well, I think we can certainly say that if the conditions are right for something like banking union to come into place, then new institutions and existing institutions get new responsibilities can start to move with remarkable speed. So we can see that with the European supervisory authorities and the European Systemic Risk Board, in particular with ESMA, the Securities and Markets Authority, which actually does address some of those issues about having a supranational authority in place as well as national competent authorities, so preserving the proximity, and does address issues about having guidance at supranational level which operates on a comply or explain basis. So there's potentially some solutions there. Looking at the ECB, which has, I think, done a remarkable job in a relatively short period of time in assuming its supervisory capacities, officially from November 2014, but of course acting more or less for a year before that in terms of the comprehensive assessment, stress testing, asset quality review before it took on its role. The way that the ECB has made itself operational on the supervisory side, so setting up joint supervisory teams of national competent authorities and ECB staff, has, I think, started to deliver on its objective to be intrusive, tough, hands-on. And one of the ways, there are many, but one of the ways in which you can see that, and certainly one that's interesting from a legal perspective, is how high priority has been attached to questions about the issue of fundamental rights and their operation in the single supervisory mechanism context. So the two-level decision-making processes within the mechanism of the ECB and national bank supervisors operating in together makes for a very complex system of shared or mixed administration, and it is leading to very challenging questions for lawyers. So differences in substantive or due process requirements, depending on whether you're on the receiving end of a decision of the ECB or a national supervisor, potential there for different treatment, and there's different legal orders of things like rules about self-incrimination, rules about legal privilege, rules about double jeopardy, are giving rise to some quite difficult questions about inconsistency of treatment and also lacunae in sort of legal protection. So that's at a very detailed operational level. Stepping back from that to perhaps a broader level of legal design issues, and what we've learned from doing and deepening. Well, we've certainly learned that there is room for very considerable legal ingenuity and creativity. So finding of legal bases in the treaty for the creation of new agencies, using what's in the treaty to empower the ECB to take on those supervisory responsibilities, finding a way for the single supervisory mechanism to extend to member states that don't use the euro, a closed cooperation concept, something really innovative, giving the ECB the power to make decisions based on national legislation, so enabling the ECB to operate within the national legal order. All of those things are highly innovative but necessary for the sort of banking union framework. As is well known, in some respects there's been a stepping outside of EU law and to the use of sort of intergovernmental solutions in a variety of contexts and for a variety of different, largely politically driven reasons. So the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance, the European Stability Mechanism Treaty, the Intergovernmental Agreement on the Single Resolution Fund within the sort of bank resolution context. So, as the 5 Presidents' report says, these can be explained by the shortcomings of the ADEMU architecture. It's interesting that there is a recourse to intergovernmental solutions in public international law in circumstances where there is the potential to engage national treasuries or other national considerations involved. Also innovative has been the way in which the court has supported these sort of efforts to build a more resilient system. The test cases, the Pringle case on the European Stability Mechanism, the ESMA case on the delegation to agencies, and the Garweiler decision on the sort of OMT programme of the ECB. All of which demonstrating, I think, a very sort of clear-sighted view by the court on the political and economic significance of their decisions in taken in a legal context. Now you can say that's all very encouraging and that's great. It's a kind of sense of law, the law actually sort of being willing to support these developments in almost a kind of, you know, whatever it takes type of fashion. And you can see there are lots of potential to borrow ideas for fiscal union as well. For example, I've seen some work that's been done trying to develop a framework for the development of a European unemployment insurance framework, looking in particular at the way in which the resolution fund has been set up under an intergovernmental agreement with national compartments, which that will be gradually mutualised. So you can see this all in a very positive light. But there is another standpoint as well, from and one that is engaging much legal debate. You can see all of this kind of looking for different solutions, going as far as you can in the treaties, stepping outside the treaties, the European treaties, into public international law as something that is actually rather sort of troubling. Messy would be one sort of argument, but of course complicated things can be managed. The difficulties go somewhat deeper than that, that by stepping outside EU law, recourse to intergovernmental solutions, you're losing the checks and balances that you get within the EU legal processes. You get a kind of system of integration a la carte, which is undermining of the system, and you get bodies that are outside the EU framework, which give rise to legitimacy and accountability, sort of democratic accountability concerns of a magnitude that are greater than within the EU, which is not perfect in those fronts itself. So those sort of that tension within the legal literature between those who would sort of see this as a sort of positive and those who would see the dangers there is a very real one, and there are questions about how far you can go, and including with respect to the court as well. And you can say the court is being politically sensitive in its decisions, but you can sort of perhaps find that perhaps a little bit troubling in the sense of whether the court is being sort of perhaps drawn into areas where it's is in a rather difficult situation. So that's one kind of line of inquiry, but I will just add one footnote to that, just to say that if we're looking for the kind of difficulties and the challenges here, actually the challenges could come from a different direction as well. Because if you look at the Five Presidents report in its overall terms, it does have a level of ambition and vision. It is bold in a variety of ways. For example, the idea of having a single European capital markets supervisor and lots of substantive change as well, from a legal as well as from an organisational economic perspective. But if you compare that to the more recent plan for Capital Markets Union, what you see there is something much more circumspect, much more kind of workmanlike, step-by-step, pragmatic, sort of incremental changes. That may be because the context is different, or it may signal something else. It may signal a change of sort of political sentiment that is slowing momentum, not just perhaps in deferral to the UK's sensitivities at the moment with respect to referendum and the like, but that actually that there is a kind of slowing of the sort of political appetite of that for significant change in this area. That might be perhaps welcome to those who worry that what we've done with improving banking union has pushed the boundaries of legality a little bit far. But at the same time, it might be unwelcome perspective of thinking that, well, actually, overall, there's unfinished business here, and we do need that sort of momentum to carry on. So I think that's the challenge for many, but certainly for the academic evaluation of these issues, to make sure that we do come up with sensible ideas and that we can help them to move forward.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's very good to be here. I have a lot of friends here, and I've already seen very interesting research. Still, I feel a little bit like an outsider, and partly perhaps because the unfortunate fact that the discussion about European institutions is not really a salient thing in Swedish policy debate. A French president said that Sweden is a small country north of Europe, and why not really geographically correct? I guess maybe he caught something in there. So anyway, you have to forgive me for giving a little bit of an outsider's view. So the question is, what type of fiscal union? And I guess in order to answer that, you have to define what purpose a fiscal union has. And I think it's actually important and somewhat lacking in the discussion exactly what we are supposed to have the fiscal union for. So let me just give you a couple of motives that I could think of, certainly not a complete list. First obvious purpose is to provide redistribution or insurance between different states. The distinction between distribution and insurance is in principle, clear and so, but in practice we all know that that's kind of relatively difficult to do. And I would suspect here, like Charlie, that we are relatively far away from a situation where actually we could have a strong system for redistribution or insurance. And it's not only about institutional design, it's about having a feeling of pan-Europeanism, or having a pan-European policy for where people can speak directly to people, politicians can speak directly to people in all parts of the country. So without that, I think these things are quite difficult. Of course, we have it in the US to some extent, but also there it is difficult, right? The resentment to giving money to the federal government is pretty strong in the US, and I don't really want to go that way, maybe. Another motive is fiscal coordination. And here I'm thinking of the fact that obviously there are spillovers from fiscal policy, and in principle that would also call for some coordination. I doubt really that that's a kind of a sufficiently strong argument for having a fiscal union. It's to me not clear whether typically fiscal policy is too active or too passive, and if coordination is needed, I would suspect that more informal coordination could do. A third motive is to help countries. Help, perhaps in quotation mark, to help them to pursue sound fiscal policy and undertake necessary structural reform. And this is obviously something that's discussed a lot, and we have heard Charlie was talking about it and many others and some papers earlier about the problems here, and that some of these pressures that are motivated by this factor comes from moral hazard issues. I would like to emphasize something else than the moral hazard issue, and it goes a bit along the lines of Jesus' presentation, and that is that a crisis is, as Jesus said, clearly a window of opportunity for reform. It's an eye-opener. Structural problems become much more easy to detect, and thus it creates a window of opportunity that should be taken. And we need to have institutions that really make us able of doing that. And in order to grab this opportunity of doing structural reform, many things are important, and one key thing is that there has to be reasonably coherent, reasonably correct, and widely held story about what caused the crisis and really what we should do about it. And clearly, in the current crisis, we have in the euro area failed substantially in this. We haven't really been able to create such a story. And I think that some of the institutions and something that we have really make it actually more difficult to create such a story than otherwise. So let me again go back to the outsider's view here and talk a little bit about this countries north of Europe. So we had a big crisis in the 90s, as you know, and I think that we really managed to take the lessons and did substantial structural reforms in many ways. As in Jesus' discussion, I think that it wasn't really anything with moral hazard that caused the crisis. The reason was rather that Sweden had been doing very well from the 1870s to the 1970s. Then we kind of overdid things. A very clever union economist in Sweden, for the labor blue-collar workers' union, he said that the key reason for why Sweden failed and went into this crisis is that success breeds stupidity. And I think that was actually true. And that's more or less, I guess, what Jesus also says, right? That it's difficult. But then the crisis became, and it was an eye-opener. And we did basically everything that was necessary to fix the underlying negative structural trends and came back. And what was necessary for us to be able to do all these things, pension reform, tax reform, change fiscal policy framework, change in the wage setting, more or less complete makeover. Banking. Well, I think that there were a couple of important things. And one was that the crisis made it clear that status quo was not an option. Otherwise, in politics, status quo bias is kind of very typical for Macro-Olson type problems and whatever. If a crisis arises, it's necessary to understand for everyone that status quo is not an option. The other thing was that it became clear to everyone that we all sat in the same small boat and no one else was going to help us. A clear, a small example, but nevertheless I think it gives you the feeling of it, is that the Swedish finance minister, Göran Persson, who later became prime minister, he went to Wall Street to borrow money to fail, and he clearly described the disgrace of standing in front of 25-year-old grinning finance puppies, as he called them, explaining the Swedish welfare state and why these guys should lend him money. And his conclusion was, when he came back, that, you know, we just had to take what they gave us, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this never happens again. It was not about sending tougher negotiators to Wall Street. It was going home and doing things that made sure that this is not happening again. And this, I think that was a quite widely shared feeling among Swedes that really helped us doing the things. And here, unfortunately, I'm not clear that, I'm not convinced at least that European institutions helped in the same way. So I guess my time is out there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for not inviting me here because I'm from here, but for being here. I have a very bad role because I'm standing in between this conference of the dismal science and your beer. So next door. It's next door, so that's easy. So my history is that I have been president of the Dutch fiscal watchdog the 7 years before I became professor here at Cambridge. So I have been listening quite interested to what other people said. Let me comment a bit. I think what worries me about the future of the discussion on fiscal policy in Europe is that the current fiscal compact seems to be clearly inadequate. I think it's not credible because it imposes on Italy the obligation to reduce its debt from 120 to 60% in 20 years' time. I find it very hard to believe that that's really going to happen. I think it's undesirable because it imposes upon countries the rule that should have a 1% structural deficit. And if you then count with a 3% nominal growth rate, you can calculate that there will be sovereign debt that will be 33% in equilibrium. I think that's very low. And maybe following up on what Charlie Bean was saying, the current situation had inevitable austerity for Italy and Spain, for the PIGS countries basically. But also, strangely enough, the Netherlands did some austerity and Germany did some austerity. And the strange thing about the Netherlands was that the Netherlands just did it to obey to the rules that Europe imposed upon it. And to give something like what is for the Netherlands special, we have now the balance of payment surplus of 10% or 9%, sorry, I'm exaggerating 1%. And we have 10% of employment, so there is something very strange going on why this happens in the Netherlands. So I find it very difficult. I found myself in a very difficult position in the Netherlands when being president of the fiscal institution. I'm thinking that the policy that we were imposing on the Netherlands was not really wise. Let me say some words about the history of the Netherlands, which is very similar to the history of Sweden, this 10-year time differential. The Netherlands had this big crisis in 1982. That was really when the country went bankrupt almost, not due to a banking crisis, but we had house price decline of 50%. We had unemployment rates of far above 10%. Moreover, we had more than 1 million people on the disability law, which was financed by natural gas resources, which were basically finished. So we had to do something, exactly the same as in Sweden. And we did so very successfully. We really changed the country, or we, basically the Prime Minister and his Minister of Finance. And sometimes I think the way the Netherlands viewed this discussion and had, so because the Netherlands was supported very much the current fiscal compact, was also given by this experience of the 80s where we really successfully did that. And so the thing is, you should do that all the time. But I think the current crisis is in some aspects somewhat different from the crisis we had in the 80s. So I think that the discussion on the fiscal union is crucial, and I find it very unfortunate that many people seem to back off. That I think it will be very difficult, Charlie Bean made notice, it will be very difficult to make progress on that issue, and I think it's very important that we keep discussing on that. Then if let me, here I have maybe somewhat particular view. It seems to me that demography is a rather important ingredient of the crisis that we're going through. It is now, so let's say in most OECD type countries, fertility rates came down quite strongly around 1970. And if you then make the calculation, you know that all the people, the last large cohorts, so the cohorts born between 60 and 70, are now approaching retirement age, and they are saving like hell. And so it seems to me that if you look at the world economy, then that factor plays an important role. That plays an important role in Japan, that plays an important role in China. If you just numerically, it's clear that China has a major role in the savings glut, just because its consumption is so low, for understandable reasons. And so my reading of what's going on is that an excess saving, probably mostly driven by demography, plays a role in what's going on in the world economy. Now the crucial question there is, so in some sense there is a lack of stores of value. We all want to save for consumption tomorrow and nobody wants to consume today. There is a serious budget constraint, but the budget constraint is not today's consumption, it's basically on tomorrow's consumption, which is also a very serious budget constraint. We all want to have a claim on the consumption tomorrow, and basically it's very difficult to honor all those claims, which is, it's not an easy problem to solve. And the similar problem we had in Japan. Everybody is buying sovereign debt in Japan because everybody wants to have a large savings to be able to protect itself to consumption problems next year. But that deals obviously budget constraints this year in the reverse direction. And so I think that from that point of view, sovereign debt cannot be too low at this point in time. And that all those theories of bubbles, Terrell Simmel paper, which are not very popular these days, might nevertheless have some relevance. That if we don't have the government taking up part of the sovereign debt, we get very low real interest rates and very low return on capital, which might make capital markets not very stable. I was particularly taken by the analysis of Ramon Marimon and Martin Uribe. And I think that basically the lesson from that, also what you see from the US, is that in a monetary union it's very simple. That individual states cannot have high debt. And if you then think that there must be some sovereign debt related to the demography problem, then it must be the case that there in some way becomes a high federal debt, or higher federal debt, let's say it that way. And I think that's the challenge that we face. And I think that all the stories that go on, or many stories that we hear now, are too much about low state debt, and there's not enough thinking about how we can organize something like high federal debt. So how do we get there? Yeah, in theory, on the drawing table it's easy to do. On the drawing table it is something like let every country be the lower part of its sovereign debt transferred to something like European debt, and let every country take care of its own surplus on top of that, which will be quite a lot for Italy and much less for Germany and for the Netherlands. But nevertheless, that would be the starting point. I think that's the way we have to go, one way or another. It's not a popular way, but I don't see much alternative for doing that. Is that for beer or?
Thank you very much. I think We have so many questions and points of view that we have to open the debate a bit. So who wants to?
Just on the European Fiscal Board. So one of the issues is, yes, you need the National Fiscal Council to really understand the fine details of each country. I mean, even a small country like Ireland, the Fiscal Council is important to really provide a view on fiscal features. On the other hand, I look around and I see all sorts of people being appointed to these fiscal councils. So I don't necessarily trust every fiscal council in the EU. So I think, you know, one of the 5 Presidents' report general narratives is to rebuild trust. So you do need some kind of editorial committee just checking, you know, and if you know that there's a European Fiscal Board reading your material with some technical skill, it has to rebuild trust. So I think, you know, you were talking about comply or explain. It's a little bit like that. So I wouldn't view it necessarily, I don't know what the intention is, for just from reading the report. It'd be much more about editorial or refereeing a quality check rather than imposing some view. So that's my sense.
No, I agree with you what you're saying. So the process, how these votes or these institutions or the members of this institution are appointed varies a lot, and so quality is not guaranteed in all instances. For instance, you may undergo a process of parliamentary hearing or not. Even though I have to say that if more or less the people that you appoint is minimally decent, and this not always happen, independency is really important, because even, for instance, in Spain, the first president has been appointed by the political party that is in majority. Since this appointment is reversible, so it's for a given period, and then even if there is new elections, this person will not be changed. The fact of independency makes that his decisions are, believe me, are completely different from what the minister that in fact has proposed him would like to hear. So, and this also happens, I don't know, in the Supreme Court of Justice in the US. So we know that the justice there also change opinion once they are appointed and they become completely independent. So independency, and therefore to put all the instruments so that independence is preserved, I think that it's important. Of course, I agree with you that perhaps one thing that this European board could do is, for instance, to set standards, make this refereeing service, and also perhaps unify or coordinate methodologies, because the methodologies sometimes are quite different. But I think that yes, this is something that the European board can do. And also I have to say that these independent fiscal institutions, the arrangement in each country is completely different. So for instance, in Spain, the institution is in fact one person, the president. He's the sole responsible for all the reports and for all the opinions. And the only thing that we have is that this president has a staff in divisions and has an external advisory board. In other countries, it's an office or it's a council. So how these members are appointed, this is a big issue, and I think that perhaps the European Union has something to say about the quality of the appointees.
I would like to thank the panel because I think that they have made excellent intervention all. But I would pick Charlie Bing for my question. So because he brought an issue about the public investment plan of the President's report, the President's report. So I agree that, in a union where things do not work, maybe you want to put another distortion, which is public investment, in order to correct other distortions, right? So like the asymmetry. However, coming from Greece, I have to say that public investment can be a poor instrument because it is the first thing that goes to rent seeking. So usually you get public investment, you know the contractors, you go to the guys that they are going to rent seeking the most. Another thing is that it is badly organized because now we are in developed countries. It's not that we're doing infrastructure and we're going to have some retention of KFP. So why don't they think about subsidizing private investment or at least giving tax credits to private investment? I think the incentives are clearer, and I think that it could be even more efficient than thinking about public investment.
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, I don't know the deliberations that the 5 individuals had amongst themselves. What I would say, though, is at the moment there's certainly been quite a lot of discussion in various international meetings about the importance of sustaining public investment and the return from infrastructure and stuff like that, and improving finance for public infrastructure. However, I think you're right that you have to be careful it doesn't end up, say, like in Japan, where you're building bridges and roads to nowhere. And if you also have issues about corruption and the awarding of contracts and so forth, the alternative instruments may well be more appealing, as you say, things that might encourage private investment. I think the current juncture, given that private investment has been depressed since the crisis, there's actually a lot to be said for doing things that would help to boost private investment. We know firms are sitting on quite a lot of cash, but not mobilising it. It also helped to address this issue of low natural real interest rates and the problems that go with that. Personally, I wouldn't rule out something like using VAT, a VAT regulator type setup. So I'm personally quite open to different instruments that might be used. And I wouldn't have a personal commitment to just public infrastructure.
If I just interrupt and just say that the program usually has included some private elements.
Oh, I said right. Okay, well, I stand corrected then. Yeah.
Juan Jiménez, Banco de Spain. My comment is for Cohen. I think I share his diagnosis of what is going on in the world economy. It's not only demographic, it's also low productivity growth and high debt from the crisis, which is making people to save so much so that the equilibrium interest rate is negative and monetary policy is having big troubles to accommodate that negative equilibrium rate. What I am not sure is that I share his vision, more public debt now. Because if the problem is that people are saving too much and they have so much debt, what you need to implement is the promises of higher income in the future. And for fiscal policy to be able to increase transfer in the future and increase the transfer to all people in the future. The constraint now is that we already have very high debt. So you should think about how to implement this in the general structure. And one way to go is about thinking about debt restructuring, private debt restructuring, to make room for in the future to be able to increase transfer to the people that now are saving too much because they expect not so much income in the future. Right? So otherwise, if you think about increasing public debt now, and you think about Ricardian equivalence and the constraint that fiscal policy has now, these promises of higher income in the future are not credible, and people will continue to save so much.
And so, the problem is that we have to rely on tomorrow. That's the big issue, and it's not easy to extend that output that investing more in capital doesn't yield that much more output. There's just too few workers in some sense. So reducing our debt doesn't solve that problem. So one way or another, we could. So the first thing, we are not getting more output tomorrow by eating less today. And I think that's the main thing that we face now. And that's what I think is part of what our sovereign debt is basically solving that. It's basically saying, so the alternative way is making a pay-as-you-go system, which is in fact equivalent to having more sovereign debt now. And then the pay-as-you-go system basically makes it possible for people now to say, look here, I know that I get income tomorrow and hence I consume today. But in some way, we cannot all save hoping to get more consumption tomorrow, because basically the budget constraint tomorrow will not allow us to consume.
Yeah, but higher public debt today would give you more input, more output tomorrow. Only investment is still active.
We can do whatever we want to get as much output tomorrow, but there will be clear limits. I think we're close to those limits.
I just wanted to cheer you all up by making an observation, which I think is actually quite an important one, which is the relative size of the 40 to 65-year-olds who are the high savers relative to the 65 pluses who are the dissavers. That relative population shares, which have been rising steadily since the sort of middle 90s, and I agree with Cohen, I think it's a key driver in the downward pressure on natural real interest rates. That ratio has just peaked, and over the next 20 years actually falls pretty rapidly. Essentially the bulge of baby boomers passing into retirement age and dissaving. So some of this may start to solve itself. So that's to cheer you up. So it should be rising.
One thing, there's obviously one policy which works very well in this regard. That's raising the retirement age. That is really very effective. So anything that you can do with that would be helpful.
And there are other things also that I think there are. I don't think we have used all the possibilities of having higher growth, higher income in the future. Here, for example, the public investment. We looked into the prioritizing how different infrastructure projects in Sweden are chosen between. And over a 10-year period in roads and railroads, we find that there were absolutely no correlation between which projects were done and their social return, the cost benefit. And had we instead chosen the best ones, the return had been much, much higher. And we can see low-hanging fruit, I think, also in many other countries in other dimensions, right? I thought it was quite interesting, an IMF report that recently came showing how far away different sectors are from the global productivity frontier in different countries. And I see in Sweden a lot of low-hanging fruit, and I'm sure that actually that exists in other countries too.
Zero provisions.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sascha Butzer. I'm Deutsche Bundesbank at University of Munich. Louder?
Yeah.
And my question is for Charlie Dean. I really appreciated your sort of analysis of how macroeconomic conditions policies have been too tight, both monetary and fiscal, in the euro area over the past years. And I was somewhat reminded of a talk Chris Sims gave at ECB last year with the somewhat blasphemic title, Coordinating Monetary and Fiscal Policy at the Zero Lower Bound. And so I'd be curious to hear views on that, because the institutional setup in England is somewhat different, between the Treasury and the Bank of England than it is in Europe, where it's very much based on the German model of extreme independence. And basically his point was that in order, now we've seen the ECB embarking in with QE, and that basically, created massive rise in prices, asset prices, but not really in the CPI. So the pass-through has been relatively weak. And Sim's argument was basically, what we need now is basically a coordination between monetary and fiscal authorities, and basically summing it up with the idea that in order to actually get the lift off from the current persistently low inflation, low growth environment, we need public spending, which is actually where the government actually commits to not finance it by future tax revenue. So basically going exactly against Ricardian equivalence in order to generate expectations of higher prices. So just to wrap, this is of course somewhat an idea which would go beyond this setting, but I was curious on your take on if we redesign institutions in Europe, is there something to take away from the design as it is in England?
Well, I mean, the key thing in the UK is we don't need explicit coordination. The way it's set up, I mean, our objective is given by I shouldn't say ours, since I'm no longer there, but the Bank of England's objective is given by the government, and then the MPC gets on with hitting the inflation target, so it has instrument independence, but goal dependence. Now, as far as the fiscal authorities are concerned, they essentially are optimising fiscal policy, knowing what our reaction function is to all intents and purposes, know what the target is. And that essentially gets rid of any sort of coordination issue that might arise in a Nash game or anything like that. So basically, the Treasury decides whatever fiscal path it wants, and it knows if it's going to have a tighter fiscal path, then the MPC, to hit its inflation target, will be duty bound to have a looser monetary stance. So that's basically the way it works. Now, the environment for the ECB is orders of magnitude difficult because it's faced not with a single countervailing fiscal authority, but 19 behaving in different ways, and they're not coordinating and so forth. However, the essential point that if fiscal policy follows a particular route, monetary policy should appropriately adjust for that in order to keep out the potential of inflation and target, I think still stands, because they've got a target of close to 2%. So if fiscal policy is too tight, the ECB ought to be relaxing monetary policy. So I don't think we need to talk about some explicit coordination. And I think there is a lot of misguided discussion. And you get it here as well about helicopter money and the need to fiscal authorities working hand in glove with the central bank. I mean, all that you need is that the central bank is committed to hitting its inflation target, which means keeping output at potential, and then you can have a more relaxed fiscal policy if that's appropriate. The Treasury, Finance Ministry can decide that, and then the central bank adopts whatever the appropriate monetary policy is.
So what's the problem now in the euro area?
Well, I think the problem has been in the euro area that there has been a reluctance in some quarters to undertake asset purchases, which, as I say, the ECB has only now been able to embrace. Now, there is a secondary question that you had about, well, it looks like it's boosted asset prices, but it's not yet had much effect on demand. I think one of the things that we do know is that there's long and variable lags from quantitative easing in the same way as there is from cuts in ordinary policy rates. And because the channel works through asset prices, and in principle the exchange rate as well, so the weakening of the euro is in part a reflection of the move to asset purchase by the ECB, and that has some effect on the market. And it does take time to work through.
So I think we have to finish. I'm being pressed to finish the session. I think we have talk for until tomorrow coming back. So thank you for all the